Hi, everyone. Welcome. Those of you who will be watching on tape, we're glad to have you. My name's Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of journalism here at NYU, the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program and the Science Communication Workshops. And I am very excited about today's program, featuring three SHERP graduates. Abby Leonard, who I believe is a SHERP 23, and Melinda Wenner-Moyer, who it was a SHERP 24, I think. Yes. And our moderator, Porva Mandavilli, who is a SHERP 17. The very first class that I think I taught at NYU were the 17s, so I'm very old. The 43s are in the house, and the 44s are coming in September. Anyway, we're very glad to have them for a topic that does not get covered enough, period, and certainly not in J school, and that is how to write well about parenting, which is something that a very large percentage of the world experiences. And there are bad and good ways to do it. Both Abby and Melinda have new books out about parenting. We'll wave them in front of you in a couple minutes. So I'm really looking forward to hearing them. Those of you in the audience, we're going to be more casual today. Just raise your hand and Apoorva will call you, but we hope there'll be plenty of questions. So with that, we'll turn it over to Apoorva Mandavilli, a global public health reporter at the New York Times.
Thank you, Dan. Can you all hear me? Okay. I'm very grateful to Dan for asking me to do this because although initially my reaction was, no, I don't have time, I actually turned out to be really great because it's like counter-programming. You got to read about something that has nothing to do with the day job, but is very, very relevant to my life because I am, as Dan pointed out, a mother. And of course, this is probably not the best way to do pleasure reading, having tabs and highlights, but I really enjoyed reading both books. They're very different. And so I'm really excited to talk to both of them. And as a journalist, as you all know, we all want to know about how the sausage gets made. So some of my beginning questions are going to be about that. So even those of you who don't have kids, I think will still actually find a lot to be interested in and relate to here. So this is Melinda's book, Hello Cruel World, Science-Based Strategies for Raising Terrific Kids in Terrifying Times. True that. And this is Abigail Leonard's book, Four Mothers, which follows four women in four different countries through the first year of their child's lives. And I can't wait to hear more about both books, but Melinda, can you introduce your book to our audience and tell us what it's about?
Yes. Oh, this is so fun. I don't hold microphones very often. Okay, so I have been writing about the science of parenting for a little while, and a couple years ago, well, it probably started more like in 2016, but it intensified where I just had this anxiety about raising kids today and how, and how was I going to instill in my kids the skills they would need to survive in this like rapidly changing world, and not just survive, but really thrive and maybe make the world a better place. And this felt like a really important thing for me to, really important problem for me to try to solve. And I had no idea if it was solvable or anything, but I would just think a lot about how concerned I was about bringing kids into this world today. So whenever I get really stressed about something, I turn to research and I say, okay, there must be a way through here, through the scientific literature. So I started looking to see, was there enough research on how skills, like crucial skills, develop in kids, and how we can, and what parents can do and other caregivers can do to nurture them and strengthen them. And I found that there was a lot to say, and a lot of it contradicted with our parenting instincts. So my book is essentially like my own response to my anxiety. I also write a parenting Substack, and I had been hearing from my readers that they too were just really feeling out of control and wondering what they could do, very anxious, wondering what they could do to help their kids grow up to be people who could do well in this world. So that was really the impetus for the book, and I just dug into a ton of different skills and characteristics and attributes, and tried to figure out how do they develop, what shapes their development, what can parents do to sort of nudge the skills in the right direction, maybe what do our instincts tell us that might not actually be backed by science, et cetera. And that is essentially what my book aims to do.
Thank you. Abby, what's your book about?
So my book deals with some similar themes. It actually comes from a somewhat similar place. It was sort of my own excavation of parenthood, but my parenthood journey was somewhat different because I moved to Tokyo when I was 6 months pregnant with my first child, which was sort of a wild thing to do in retrospect. And then I went on to have 2 more children in Japan. So I had and raised kids for 7 years in Japan, and that was both wonderful because there are so many sort of social supports there, but also difficult because it's so different from anything I was sort of used to in this country. So I was trying to navigate new parenthood and a totally new culture and language and all that stuff. And also because the gender norms there are so different from what I was sort of used to, and the expectations of mothers are so hard. I mean, I think that's a true sort of factual statement that it's very hard to be a mom in Japan. But then I came back here and realized that it's also very hard to be a mom in the US for totally different reasons. We don't have any of the public supports. Mostly don't have public supports here. Paid leave, childcare, all these sorts of things that really affect the day-to-day experience of what it is to be a parent. And so I was really interested in thinking about sort of how these larger systems and histories of a place affect the daily lives of parents. And so I decided to explore that by looking at 4 women in 4 different countries. So one of them was in Japan, one was in the US, in Utah, and then I also looked at Finland and Kenya, and they all had babies in January 2022. So I sort of used that as like the structure, as 1 calendar year, and it was their first year of motherhood, and just sort of saw what was universal about it, and also what impact culture and society have on the experience. And it was really sort of remarkable to see. Sometimes they would say the exact same things in response to the same stuff, and sometimes it was like, wow, wouldn't it be nice to have a year's paid leave and, never have to do all this sort of challenging stuff that Americans deal with. So yeah, so that's what my book's about.
I love that one in your book. You actually referred to like, oh, this would have been a great thing for Tsukasa to have, or this would have been really helpful for Chelsea. So let me actually ask the sausage question now. As writers, we always approach these topics, and Melinda, I get that impulse of like, I don't know the answer to this, so I'm going to do research. But how do you research something so massive as how to raise kids, or how motherhood is an experience in 4 different countries? So I want you to both talk about how you chose what you chose. Melinda, this is your second book. So how did you distinguish? It's almost like a sequel to the first one in some way. So how did you figure out where that book ends and this begins? And the hundreds of studies you said you read through, like how did you decide which ones? And then you have these 10 sort of chapters in your book around 3 themes. And how did you sort of approach that? And then for Abby, I don't know how you begin to choose which countries, which women. I know one of them had a miscarriage previously, at least one. And so, the sort of uncertainty of what if you pick the wrong woman, or I don't know, something goes wrong. So did you start with many and then just end up focusing on 4, or how did that all work? We want to know all the details.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I felt so overwhelmed throughout a lot of the process of reporting and writing the book in terms of like, how do I organize it? There was also, I had a lot of concern about redundancy because there are, I'm trying to talk about how 10 different sort of skills develop and what we can do to shape them. And there was definitely like overlap, which was, I found to be reassuring, like, okay, so there are certain things we can do as parents that actually help in the development of multiple skills, but I also was worried about like the reader's experience of it and reading similar things over and over. It was hard.
You address that directly in the book. You say you found it reassuring that there were these overlapping themes, and so did I as a reader.
Oh, good. But yeah, so how did I choose what to cover? I think it helps that I have been covering parenting for a while. I know a lot of people in the parenting space, a lot of child psychologists and whatnot. And when I was thinking about what skills I might want to zero in on, I just started asking everybody, like, what do you think are the most important skills for kids to have today, and why? And I asked also, I asked my newsletter readers, like, what do you think are the most important skills? What are the skills that you think you want the most help with fostering in your kids? And yeah, so I just crowdsourced essentially through, asking parents, asking experts, and found that a lot of things came up over and over again. Resilience was one that just kept coming up, and everybody's worried about that. Empathy, bias, polarization, those kinds of things. And I also uncovered some that maybe I wasn't thinking I would have a whole chapter on, like self-compassion being one. I didn't really know the degree to which self-compassion is helpful for both adults and kids. I feel like it's one of those skills that's not talked about a whole lot. I mean, it's getting a lot more traction now. But when I looked at the research, I was like, wow, this research is really powerful. And it's not a simple skill, but it's the components are somewhat simple. And I was like, this is something I could definitely get into, and I think would be.
Tell us what self-compassion is for those.
Well, self-compassion is, it's compassion directed inward. So it's, we know what compassion is, and self-compassion is just showing compassion for yourself. It's hard to do because we tend to actually be very self-critical. I certainly, when I make a mistake, when I do something wrong, I'm constantly beating myself up for it, or, saying, why did I burn the chicken? Like, I'm so dumb. Why was it? And not really considering that, there's probably a lot of circumstances that explain why this happened. I was, taking a work call, and also my kid was screaming and having a tantrum. No wonder I burned the chicken. So there's a lot of reasons why we're not very self-compassionate, but research suggests that people who are more self-compassionate do better in like a whole range of ways. So do you want me to get into like how you nurture it or not?
Just,
no.
Yeah.
Okay, that was enough for that. Okay.
Just people wanted to, I think might be wondering what exactly that is. It sounds
It's
good.
treating yourself kindly when things are hard is basically what it is.
I mean, I personally really loved that part of the book. I actually encourage you all to read it even if you don't have kids, because I think one thing that really resonated with me is the idea that if I accept myself as a very flawed human being and forgive myself for those mistakes and just own up to them with the kids, that'll make me a better parent. I was like, yes, that I can get behind.
Sign me up. Right? Yeah.
Sign me up for acknowledging my flaws. Thank you.
So I guess where was I? So that's how I zeroed in on 10 skills. It's actually a little tricky because some of them aren't like skills that you can name. I mean, one of them is like addiction. How do we prevent addiction? Like what skill is that? That's not a skill exactly, but I wanted to cover addiction. I wanted to cover what parents can do to reduce the risk for it. And also managing social media and technology is another chapter where I was like, well, I have to talk about this. This is crucial. And it is a skill to be able to develop a healthy relationship with social media and technology, but it's not like a one-word skill that is easy to, refer to. So it is a little tricky. There are parts where I wish I could just say, here are the 10 skills, and it's all one word, self-compassion, empathy, resilience, but it doesn't quite work out that way, and it's a little messy. And I was like, you know what, I'm just going to have to do it this way because I'm not going to not cover social media and technology in this book. So it was a little bit of like, making things fit that maybe didn't totally fit with the framework, but I was like, I really want to cover this anyway, and I'll deal with the repercussions of it not fitting a perfect framework. And then I tried to figure out like how is there a broader way to organize these skills, and I came up with three. The book is in 3 parts, which is coping skills, connection, like connecting, what are skills associated with like forming connections, which is very, very important, and a lot of kids and adults lack that right now. And then cultivation, like personal growth and, cultivating a better world, the skills associated with being able to do that.
Abby, tell us about your process.
Yeah, it was all sort of a leap of faith, I will say at the beginning, like that I could find people around the world sort of willing to let me follow them for a year. It's such a major commitment. But I did generally know what I was looking for, which was I wanted geographic diversity, so it sort of represents all the different areas of the world, Africa, Europe, North America and Asia. And then I also thought it'd be interesting and useful that they were all sort of middle class, like urban, that represents most of the world's population. And it also, then you can really see how these systems affect people because they're sort of starting from the same place. And I mean, it was pretty wild because they all had babies within like days of each other in January. So I was looking for that too.
And how did you find them?
Yeah, this is like always the question that people ask me first. So the US was sort of like yours. I actually posted in mothers groups and it was just sort of like, is anyone willing to do this? And I got a few. And the woman I found was just like, you know, I wanted someone who was really open and was going to like share. And she was like totally that person. I mean, she was interesting. She has an interesting backstory. She left the LDS church and was sort of like trying to forge her own identity, and figuring that out through parenthood was complicated and really interesting. So she was great.
I actually wondered about that part
Yeah.
of the. Did you worry at all that having a woman who had just left the Mormon faith would be representative enough of the American experience? Like, what if
A
she went
little
back
bit.
to the church, or I don't know?
I worried about it a little bit, but I also think, I mean, people are getting less religious, and this generation, that represents, I think, broadly sort of what's going on, that people had a community built in the US, in religious communities, where they could find things like childcare and social stimulation, all these things that moms need, and they sort of no longer have those in the same way. So I think that it ended up being somewhat representative. I mean, in other ways, like, she's a teacher, her husband's an Amazon delivery driver. They're just like, it was like, okay, this feels like America 2020.
The polyamory.
And they're polyamorous. So it really checks all the boxes.
Very America 2020.
I mean, it's not happening in Japan. These things, anyway, whatever. So yeah. Okay, so that's the U.S. And
All
then,
of a sudden, a bunch of people are like, I'm going to read the book now.
yeah, it is interesting. The other ones I found through like local reporters. So I worked with, you know, like fixer local reporter type people in Kenya, and she was just incredible. The woman I worked with in Kenya, she works a lot for the Washington Post, and Chelsea was in her community, so she knew her sister, I think, but like it was sort of her extended community, and she was able to find her that way. And then similarly, Japan, it was a fixer local reporter I'd worked with before, and she found Sukasa. And then Finland was another Finnish reporter who helped me find her. And Finland was a lot easier reporting, like in some ways. It was just, Sukasa actually doesn't even speak English, so every time I interviewed her, it was through an interpreter. And the time difference, you know, it's like 12 hours, so it would be like midnight, and she would have just put the baby to bed. This was like when she chose to do it. I wasn't asking her to be up at midnight, but it was just very fun. Like that one was just a lot harder in some ways, like when I was in the US and she was there and I wasn't in person. So that's how I found them. And then I thought about how to structure it. It's like still this like enormous amount of information about like 4 different people's lives. So I also had 3 parts in my book, and it's both chronological and thematic. So it's like it's separated into like pre-birth and then 2 6-month chunks. And then it's maternal care, paid leave, and universal childcare, like the policy themes layered on top of those, and they just sort of like naturally fit. So, but that sounds very obvious now. At the time, it was like struggling to get all of this stuff, and yeah.
I think that's a credit to the book and to you that it is so seamless, because you don't kind of want to see the wires.
Yeah, no, it's true. It took a lot. And I actually had really great editors who helped me sort of with that too. And yeah, it would sort of pull me back from stuff, like, because everyone has different threads in their lives. Like, our lives are not linear. And so they would just sort of tell me, like, we don't need to know about like how this guy responded when Russia was threatening to invade Finland, which I thought was really interesting. Like, you know, the father there was like hyper masculine, and, you know, there were just all these things, but they were like, you know, that's fine. Let's stick to the parenthood aspect of it. So, yeah, there was a lot to sort of.
There's actually very little of the men in the book, which is, you know, it's appropriate because it's about motherhood and how these women are functioning in society with their children. But I wondered, like, was that just pure coincidence that somehow they all are deadbeats in different ways, not fully there for their women,
Yeah.
and to different degrees, but none of them is like the ideal supportive husband who's actually there and doing a lot.
I know it's true. I don't know if in like looking back on it, maybe these people were talking to me because like their husbands weren't there. I don't know. Like this was sort of their project that they could have on their own that was exploring their identity, and their husbands were sort of not there for them enough or something. I mean, I don't know actually why that is. I also think in some ways it's like, you know, they're very involved husbands, and there are a lot of men who are not as involved as they should be. And so maybe it's not a totally random sampling. Like this is a thing that happens, and you can see it. Like some of them are involved before birth, and then it becomes really difficult to have an infant, and they start to sort of like
Pull
remove
back and
themselves a little
disappear.
bit. Yeah, and different societies have different ways of dealing with that. And then you sort of get into the historical stuff about like how we used to deal with some of this stuff. Like in Kenya, there were ways to sort of encourage community building, encourage fathers to be involved. In Finland, there's like more modern ways to do that, but just thinking about the best ways, you know, to do that. And then in the US, I talked to the congressman who he runs the Dad's Caucus, and it's this idea that there are all these fathers in Congress who want to be involved in family policy and sort of like leading by example. So yeah, that was definitely a theme in the book, like the male involvement in childcare and how much pressure it puts on women if they're not there.
One of the lines I liked in your book was being pro-natal is not the same as being pro-woman. And I feel like that really came through in everybody's stories. But in both of your books, I really liked the sort of historic call-outs to like really trace how things have changed over time. Because I think that also helps to make sense of the world that we live in and how we all fit into it now. Like in your case, you had a lot about, you know, how the efforts to get universal childcare into our system failed many times, and we can revisit that again. And you know, in your case, one of the things that really struck me was this idea that we're so polarized now politically. That you had the stat in there that in 1980, 56% of adolescents voted the same as their parents, but now it's like 81%. And so, how do you? This is a question for you, Melinda, specifically. But how do you think about writing about this kind of thing in a world that is changing so much? Like, how many of the lessons from parenting still translate, and is it like, are we actually now adopting a whole new parenting paradigm because we have to confront a world that looks so different?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think a lot of the skills that I cover in the book are skills that would be useful universally. You know, I mean, I could think they would have been useful for me to have developed more as a kid, and you know, but I do think that some of the trends in parenting have changed such that maybe we are doing collectively as parents having a harder time nurturing some of these skills. So I think resilience is a good example of this, where kids just have a lot less independence now than they did when we were growing up. I mean, you know, there's always the jokes about like kids growing up in the 80s, like used to, you know, walk home from school and make themselves dinner and stuff. And now it's you know, kids are not walking home from school alone. So I do think that some of the trends in intensive parenting that are so common, and meaning that there's just a lot of pressure on parents to be heavily involved in their kids' lives and really like curating everything, ensuring that they succeed, you know, putting pressure on them to do well, that has changed a lot over the past 30 or 40 years. And because of that, some of the skills that kids would have developed if we had been a little more hands-off, like resilience, are lacking, I think. I mean, there's some interesting evidence suggesting that, yeah, kids and college students just aren't as able to deal with challenges.
Take care of themselves, learned helplessness.
Right? Yes, absolutely.
And also the overriding anxiety that a lot of parents feel, right? The overprotectiveness. I thought that was very interesting, this contrast between how much society can step in and take care of your needs, and then is it that as individuals we are doing too much because our social structures or societal structures are not supportive enough? Like when you look at a place like Finland, or you know, that Netflix documentary Old Enough, I don't know if you guys have seen it, like little kids like walking to school by themselves. Kids in Japan, I think you said, walk to school at 6 by themselves. You can do that if everything else is sort of functioning properly, but do you think, and this question is for both of you, is it that these countries are different in how much society is stepping in to take care of these families, and when it doesn't, the families kind of overdo the protection and things are actually going a little haywire.
Yeah, I think that is definitely true. I mean, I think parents in this country feel a lot of personal responsibility for things that probably should be and are in other countries community responsibilities. I mean, it's like you're researching the food supply because you're not sure if it's safe. You know, there's like all sorts of issues of safety, gun safety. I mean, these should be like the hallmark of a functioning society is that children are protected and are safe. And so then, you know, if it's not there, it's internalized by usually the mother, also fathers, and you know, but it's puts an enormous amount of pressure. There's also, I think, because there's so much economic inequality in this country, because I saw it here and in Kenya, it was like there's such a long way to fall if you mess up that the stakes feel really high, whereas it just doesn't feel the same in Finland and Japan, where there's like universal health care and you know, universal schooling and all of these things. The stakes are just so much higher in our country and others
No
like
safety
it.
nets, really.
No safety nets. I mean, so yeah, parents do feel this real pressure. And I think that was one of the messages that I wanted my book to convey, was just that like this sort of madness that you're feeling in your head as a mother. Some of it's universal because, you know, it's hard to be a first-time mom, but a lot of it is because we're expected to do things that our community and our society should be there for us and is not doing.
There's really interesting research on the relationship between economic inequality in countries, I'm sure you know this, and how much parents, how many resources parents spend on their kids. And it's thought to be like parents are so much scareder about their kids' futures in an economic unequal society that they are just putting time, money, energy, you know, into raising their kids because they want to give them the edge to make it. And yeah, falling is, yeah, you don't want them to fail. Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said. And I think that in countries where there are no social safety nets, there's also, like ours, I think there's just more of a sort of cultural expectation for parents, especially mothers, to feel that it's morally right to do everything, to like give up their jobs, to do everything for their kids. And it's because we have to in a way, and it's sort of a convenient way to make sure that somebody's picking up the slack. Like, oh, it's the mom's job to do all of these things. It's not the government's job, and it takes off the pressure off of the government.
I can't help but connect that to some of what we're seeing, you know, in the public health domain too, where because people don't feel protected by the government, they then think they have to do their own research. They become the experts, but they're not actually qualified to be the experts or to do these, you know, it's really the job of the government to make these kinds of decisions. And when they don't see that, I was just thinking about, we have a trip that's being organized for my daughter's class, and they're all supposed to fly to Maine on a flight. It's a reasonably sized plane from what I can tell, but there were parents on this parent group. We have a WhatsApp group for the parents. There was one parent in particular who said, no, I'm not sending my kid because it's really dangerous. That plane might crash, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just like a perfect example of sort of the failed risk assessment. And then another parent stepped in who is some sort of scientist and said, no, this doesn't make any sense. Your child is much more at risk in a car. But this is the sort of, you know, the overprotective, I don't trust anything that's going on in government, therefore I will step in and make these decisions because there's no sense of structure around us. It's like we are solely responsible for everything that happens to our children.
That's true. And I would also say there's like an inequality of benefits that matters too. I mean, you can think about, you know, like I said, the husband of the American woman, he worked for Amazon as a delivery driver and he got no paid leave. And then someone who works at Amazon in management would get like, you know, a father would get 6 months or something. And so I think that also matters, that, you know, it sort of matters who your employer is as far as your protections and stuff. And so really people are on their own in that way too. And I think it sort of, as far as advocacy, it kind of breaks down those efforts in some ways, activism around this stuff, because some people already have what like the woman in Finland had to some extent. You know, they have all this paid leave, they have even childcare through their work and stuff. So just thinking about inequality, and not only income inequality, but also like as far as benefits, and then you really feel like you're on your own and you have to go do your own research, and government has never really done that much for you. So like, who do you look to? Your employer? I mean, then you're stuck. It's just like, it's such a sort of particularly American problem. But the other thing that was interesting was to see in Kenya how they're sort of bringing over a lot of these American ideas. And so like that healthcare system now has both a public and a private component. And so it's like we're also like exporting this sort of chaotic system. It's like-
Dysfunction.
yeah, I just found that really interesting. Yeah.
You had a line in your book about how the US is really good at research, but not so good at implementation. It's like-
Yeah, right. The Finnish system was based on this like great research out of St. Louis or something. I can't remember which city it was, but it was like, why don't we do that? You know, like these things about like home visits and stuff that were being used in Finland. So all the moms get like checked in on, and then it worked really well here in that city. Yeah. So we figure it out, and then we, you know,
we let other
put it into
people do the
practice.
great policies.
Yeah. Wow.
Yes, but that is kind of sad that they're also just exporting the dysfunction. And yeah, there was
Both, yeah.
right. Yeah. There was one part in your book, Melinda, I'm going to actually read from this one little part. To me, this was very American, this thinking. I didn't grow up in this country. That's my excuse. But that's why I can say this. But it said, mental health is not about feeling good all the time. I feel like this is the very American concept, that people are supposed to be happy all the time. And if you're not, there's something wrong with you. So I really liked this part. It said, mental health is not about feeling good all the time. Mental health involves feeling emotions that are appropriate to the circumstances and having the tools to cope with them. I love that. I think that's really a very clear way of thinking about, like, because your life is never always going to be great and happy. And the idea that that's really what we should be achieving for is our ability to cope with everything that comes our way. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I really can't take credit for that. That framing is something Lisa D'Amour talks a lot about in her book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. And I mention her many times in my book. I love Lisa D'Amour. But yes, so this relates to, I talk a lot about how we engage with our kids' feelings, how we talk about feelings, and because parents, we tend to really hate it when our kids have like negative feelings, big negative feelings, because I mean, for obvious reasons, we want our kids to be happy, we want them to be okay. And so when they're struggling, we either want to immediately fix the problem for them, or we want to have them think that they don't have the problem anymore. We say like, it's okay, it's not that big of a deal, you don't need to be crying, calm down. Like we downplay, we dismiss their feelings, thinking like this will make them go away. But this is really counterproductive, and we are thinking about it kind of backwards, because the more opportunities we have to let our kids experience feelings, to know that big negative feelings are normal and expected, the more practice they have with that, the more they can sit with it, they know that it's okay, that we feel comfortable with their feelings, the more practice they will have developing coping skills that will help them throughout their lives, because we're all going to be encountering challenges. And so there's this paradoxical belief that as parents, we should be protecting our kids from challenges and hardship, when actually we should be doing the opposite. We should be, to a degree, we don't want to be exposing our kids to trauma. But the interesting thing is too, and Lisa D'Amour talks about this in her book, is that trauma is not defined by the experience itself. Like a person, two people can have the same experience. One person will experience it as trauma and another person won't. And she says, there's so many different things that shape whether an experience becomes traumatic for a person, obviously. But she says one of the things that does shape it is their ability to use healthy coping skills. Like, can they cope with that experience? Do they have the practice they need? So she says, letting kids experience a safe level of discomfort and pain can actually make them less likely to experience trauma, because through that practice, they become better at developing coping skills, which then means that if they experience something really hard, they might be less likely to experience trauma from it. So yeah, it's
peanut allergy, exposure therapy.
Yeah, it's exposure therapy, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Abby, can you talk a little bit more about your reporting process? I'm endlessly fascinated by how you end up reporting a book with 4 women in all these different parts of the world. In one part, I remember thinking somebody was driving a car, I think it might have been Sarah in Utah, and you described the road signs she passes before she gets really tired and pulls over. Like, how do you get that kind of detail from people you're not actually in the same place with? I'm assuming you weren't in the car with her.
No, yeah. I asked them all like really annoying questions over and over again. I remember asking Tsukasa, like, because she told me that her dad drove her to the hospital when she was in labor in a Volvo. And I was like, are there many Volvos in Japan? Really, there just aren't that many foreign cars in Japan. And so I like went back and asked her again. She was like, it was a Volvo. I don't know. And she was like, what is happening right? Like, why are you asking me about this?
Why don't you believe me?
Why don't you believe me? Like, what is, and I don't know. And it's through an interpreter. Like, the whole thing is super awkward or just kind of odd. But she was very game. So I did a lot of that, like details, having them recall. I also, because I visited them, but when I wasn't there, I still enlisted the local reporters to go, and they took a lot of videos and photos for me and did a lot of recording interviews. So a lot of times I would sort of base it on those, and I could actually see what was going on. And then, yeah, when I was there, I would sort of ask them, like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of examples. Chelsea went to get her daughter's ears pierced, and I went to that place with her, and she told me, oh, it was the same chemist who was here last time when I got my daughter's ears pierced. So then I could describe that woman. So I really tried to recreate everything that happened to them in sort of vivid detail. And my background's actually in broadcast journalism, so I think I was thinking visually, like I was thinking about B-roll almost in the way I was like writing, it was like you have the
That scene is very much like B-roll. She's like driving, and these signs are flashing by, and then she gets getting tired, and she pulls over. It's like you're watching something. I mean,
yeah.
of course, as reporters, we all ask for details, but like that kind, I would never have thought to ask somebody, what road signs did you pass on the way? That's genius.
I think it was license plates, right? Was it road signs?
Possibly.
But anyway, yeah, same thing. And it was like I was trying to. I mean, I was there, and I think I talked to her about it because it was like remarkable to me that all the Utah license plates either said like Ski Utah or In God We Trust or something. It was something very Utah, and I talked to her about it. And that was just sort of what you saw when you were there. So I asked her about that, and I thought it was sort of evocative of like the place, like it was beautiful and very religious. Yeah.
Yes, right. Okay. One thing that both of your books talk about is, I mean, Abby, yours very directly, and Melinda, yours only in parts, but about the gender differences. So, Melinda, in your book, you talk in one part about how girls are more likely to be depressed and boys are more likely to take their own lives and maybe feel angry. And how do you think those kinds of differences play out in this social framework that you've both written about?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think we all feel the same emotions, but boys and girls are socialized differently in terms of what's sort of acceptable to display. And so, boys are socialized to not show fear and sadness. And so they often show that as anger. It often turns into anger. I see this with my son all the time. It's also in how I talk a lot about how girls and boys are socialized in relationships because, and this is for my section on connection, because both boys and girls, there's a lot of talk about the crisis of connection in boys in particular, boys and men, very lonely and a lot of suicide. And it's getting worse. And so I wanted to figure out, what is happening? Why is this happening? And does it have to do with how we're socialized? And so I do talk a lot about how boys are sort of socialized from a very young age, and there's really interesting work, qualitative work with psychologists who observe boys over time and how their relationships change, how they act in their relationships, and how boys around the age of 4 start to they're very touchy-feely and they hug their friends, and then all of a sudden it's like they perceive this is not okay for me to be doing, and they start holding back and they start saying I don't have really good friends, like I'm not gay, all this stuff that comes out around masculinity norms.
Some of that touching stuff is very uniquely American too, right? Because I grew up in India where men walk hand in hand all the time and it's not a big deal.
Right, that would never happen here. Yeah. But I also talk about girls and how they are socialized to sacrifice themselves for their relationships and their authentic sort of needs and wants for their relationships. And there's some really interesting work that followed adolescent girls over time at a school in Ohio. And these researchers would interview these girls, starting around, from age 8 and up. And they would see these shifts around like age 12, 13, where the girls before would talk about how, they would make choices that they wanted to make and assert themselves and stand up for themselves. And then around age 13, they would start saying, I don't know what I like. I don't know how I feel. And they would sort of lose themselves and lose touch with their wants and needs. And then also start talking about how they would make choices to serve their friends, to not hurt their friends, to not to not upset any social dynamics, and they sort of sacrifice themselves for those friendships and those relationships, and how that is very isolating as well, and that creates loneliness as well. And so they're different, but they kind of also have a similar end result in some ways, in which people, both boys and girls, can end up feeling very isolated and very sort of out of touch with either themselves or others, in ways that are not good.
And in your book, Abby, the moms end up doing so much of the child labor themselves. They're actually very isolated in some ways. Almost all of them go through periods of like feeling incredibly lonely and like their partners are nowhere nearby. And yet some of the partners, well, the one in Finland, Masa in particular, but really all of them to some extent seem to think this has nothing to do with them. There's no connection there. They're just sort of, and they blame the women almost for their lack of connection to the child, as if it's the woman's responsibility to foster that bond and build it.
Yeah, gender roles are a big thread in the book, and I think it's interesting I mean, if you compare Finland and Japan, it's interesting because they have similar supports in some ways, like the long parental leave, and but the gender roles are so different that it really affects the experience of those. And I think part of the issue between the woman in Finland and her partner is that he's not from Finland, and he like can't get on board with the egalitarian nature of child raising there to some extent, and it basically like dooms their relationship. I mean, they just sort of like can't get past it, but it because there's strong support, she can kind of do what she wants to do to some extent and raise the child on her own, and she doesn't need him necessarily. I had some compassion for the Japanese husband, who I just think there's such a culture of work there, particularly for men, that I think he wanted to be more involved, and it was just I think it's very, very hard.
Couldn't really do it.
Yeah.
And Sarah's partner was also wanting to be part of it at times.
He definitely wanted to too, and it was a similar, like, work was sort of always, he didn't get any paid time off and all this stuff, and so it was hard for him. I think he was a very caring, like, he tried to be an involved father, but you do see how, like, once social expectations sort of hit and then your relationship changes and you go down that road, it's very hard to, I mean, Sarah wanted a more egalitarian relationship. She had all these ideas about how her family she created was going to be the different from the one she grew up in. That was, it was like her one of 7 siblings. Her mom took care of them all. That was the thing. And she wanted to be different. And then it's just very hard if you don't have social supports to do it. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the importance of paternity leave and how that's really changed? The numbers have gone up, but also the expectation that men will take it can really alter, rather than sort of feeling like, oh, you're the only guy in this company who's going to take paternity leave. And so nobody still does.
In Japan in particular, or just in general?
In general, yeah.
In Finland, it's sort of been true that men get parental leave for like a few generations. So as it was explained to me, like, it used to not be sort of acceptable, and now it's really just over time, like, that policy has led culture, which is sort of an interesting thing to think about, sort of how policymakers can set the agenda, and then society will sort of follow in some ways. And now there's this idea that fathers have a right to time with the kids and kids have right to time with their dads, which I think is a really nice way of thinking about it, that they should have that time. And so now it's like the only country in the world where men spend more time with their kids than women. And Japan is really trying to do this because, I mean, it's mostly in response to the birth rate stuff, that they're just like throwing everything at the wall to see what's gonna get women to have more kids. And they're like, well, maybe if we can get the men more involved, that would help. And so, but that work culture makes it very hard to do. It's very sort of taboo still to take time off. But the interesting thing is, just in the past couple years, and since I reported the book, they have a new policy where they, like, big companies have to report how many fathers who are entitled to paternity leave actually take it, and they publish it sort of publicly. And then the idea is that, like, companies that are doing better, more people will want to work there, and it's a way to sort of shame the companies that aren't doing their part. And it's actually working. The rates of paternity leave have, like, doubled in the past couple years. So there are ways that you can change it. And I think the same thing happened in California. It was like, once men could take parental leave, a lot of them did. And so that policy can be really really important in people's lives.
Porba, can I follow up on that? Yeah, so Abby, you mentioned birth rate concern in Japan, and Japan was really the first society that I think faced this and addressing it, but it's coming up now in the U.S. too. That insightful social thinker J.D. Vance talks about it all the time, you know, as a crisis. And I have noticed, you know, it's certainly been obvious to me that sort of when I was in my 20s, sort of the default was that you know, you would probably have kids. And now the default, at least for some segments of society, is you probably won't have kids. You know, just in my conversations with my own students, including some in this room, the default is often, well, I don't think so. And so there are all kinds of issues raised by that. You know, why? Is this about the lack of social support and structure? Is it about changing roles of women and men, more opportunities for women? Is it about, is it a political act, you know, related to concerns about climate change and resources? There are just all kinds of things that are raised by what seems to be a pretty fundamental shift, at least in some demographics, about attitudes toward having children. So I guess there's a lot of things that you guys could talk to about that. But I'm most interested in the whys. You know, why is it happening? Why is it happening? And is it in fact a problem, or is it a good thing? Is it a crisis that Japan and other industrialized countries are facing, or is it an opportunity? Is it a good thing?
Finland too, right? Despite all the societal support.
That's the problem with the clear argument that it's social support stuff, because Finland's birth rate has also been declining for a long time. It does seem like it's an actual problem. I mean, it's interesting because, like, I feel like 20 years ago, the whole idea was that this was like a sort of climate catastrophe. Like, the more people, that was going to be a problem, and now it's that there are too few people, and that's an economic problem. And it seems like that is true to some extent. Like, this social safety net sort of break down if you don't have enough young people feeding into the system to support the retirees. And also, like, technological innovation and stuff slows down if you just don't have the sheer number of people coming up with new ideas, which I think is sort of an interesting piece of this. And immigration can solve some of it, but, you know, it's sort of happening worldwide. So at some point, you know, it's just sort of a problem. I don't know. I mean, I've thought a lot about it. I think, like, I had my first kid 10 years ago, and I feel like I, to some extent, did not know what I was getting into. There wasn't like the same social media stuff. There wasn't as much thought about, you know, the crisis of parenthood or thinking about how hard it was and all of that stuff. You just sort of, like, you just, it was what you were expected to do. And I think a lot has changed in the last decade, which is probably good. I mean, people should know and be able to choose whether or not they want to take this on. But just as far as, like, J.D. Vance's comments, I mean, they're just so obviously offensive, but I think they're also pretty misguided, because when you look at the research on some of this stuff, the idea that you can convince someone to have a kid who doesn't want a kid is probably unlikely. But there are a lot of American families who stop short of having the number of kids they would like to have. Like, they might have 2 instead of 3. I have 3, and it's like so remarkable to people. I mean, it's just not done as much, but I feel like when I was growing up, there were a lot of like 3 and 4 kid families, but now it is really expensive. The cost of childcare is like insane, and you know, more every year. And so, and cost of childcare, there was some survey that showed that was like the #1 thing that people said why they didn't have as many kids as they would like to have. So I guess my response to him is just, you know, stop focusing on the like childless cat lady thing and focus on the American families who want to have more kids but can't do it because America makes it so impossible to have families here and have the number of kids you want.
Anybody else have any questions in the audience?
Yeah, I've got the microphone here, and we'll just pass it around. Here's a question.
Hi, I'm Sylvan Soloway, the Career Services Director here and Multimedia Professor. And I just wanted to follow up on Dan's question, and I'm sorry if you covered it. I was a little late. But regarding Japan specifically, and maybe you can compare it to Finland, my understanding from a friend who lives in Tokyo is that and she's a lawyer with an MBA and speaks, fluent Korean and Japanese, and gets job offers thrown at her all the time from like all the big, Fortune 500 companies. But the job postings often in Japan say like, don't apply if you're over 35 or if you're a mom. Like they blatantly discriminate against mothers and expect that if you are going to have a baby, then okay, thank you so much for your service as an employee. We'll see you later. Like I have a friend who works for NHK in Japan, and she was a reporter, and essentially when she wanted to have a kid, they told her, if you decide you want to come back, you're gonna have to reapply, and you have to fill out a form now declaring that you might even want to consider coming back after you have your kid. So yeah, I just wanted to find out what you could tell us in regards to how those policies have an impact, and if it's more significant in Japan than Finland.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
stuff is all true, and it's pretty interesting. I mean, I think historically there was, after World War II, it got very gendered. Like there was the salaryman and the housewife, and then there were roles for women at companies, but they were often sort of clerical, and they were like mommy track jobs, and it was expected that you would leave after you had a kid, and that was just sort of like how society operated. And even like I talk about this in the book, but an introduction session at the preschool for my kids' school, and the principal was like, asked us all to go around and introduce ourselves and say what we did before becoming a mommy, as if there was like, yeah, this before time when I was a working woman and now I am a mommy. Like that was, and I think like probably everyone was sort of. This other woman was like, well, now I'm a doctor. Like it was just like it's this sort of weird thing holdover. No, she was a Japanese woman. It was so great that she was like, I'm an endocrinologist. I thought it was so cool. But, and Japan now, the stats are, there's more women in the workforce than the US. I mean, it's like they've really, because they're trying to get more women to work, and it's actually been effective, but women still do 7 times more domestic labor than men. So it's like that hasn't shifted as much. Yeah, there's all that kind of stuff, and it's very like nuclear family, not sort of like any other kind of family forms, like LGBT stuff. I mean, all of that is just really not, it's very traditional. Yeah, I think it's really holding back. It would be interesting to see if any of that changed, how the birth rate would change. My sense, even just from interviewing Tsukasa, was that it was so onerous to be a mom. She wanted to have another kid, and at the end of like the first year was like, oh God, like I don't think I can do another one. And that's terrible, like she should be able to have as many kids, especially when the government is aligned, also wants her to have a lot of kids. And yet it's so difficult to, navigate professional and domestic world. So, yeah.
I mean, the birth rates are going up in a couple of parts of the world, right? They're still going up in parts of Asia, and they're going up in Africa. It's just, it's only in the Western world.
It was interesting to go to Kenya and Japan in the same month. I can't remember. I was there pretty close together, and Kenya just feels so young and vibrant. Everyone is really young. And Japan, it's like, if I came back in 20 years, like half of the people on this train car aren't going to be here. It's like, you could just feel it like being there. So yeah, it's totally different.
Now it's actually, I mean, during COVID, that was one of the things that people think may have helped both Africa and parts of Asia, is that there were so many young people that you didn't see as much mortality because there were more young people than older people, right? Any other questions? Oh, Karina?
Hi, I'm curious about, in your books, if you could share any steps you took when you're talking about parental, experiences and parenting advice to avoid, any sense of judgment. I feel like in parents I talk with, it's so much like, well, it's like so much is about like how will other parents see it, and I feel like more than any other relationship we have, it's like there's a lot of pressure and self-judgment, not self-compassion about like what to do. So, and then also relatedly, I'm wondering if like you have a sense if readers are still open and to advice from researchers in child psychology, maybe more than in other types of research right now, like infectious disease, for example.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little. This is a needle that I try very hard to thread, which is, and I don't know that I'm always successful, but I'm hyper aware of how much pressure is on parents and how there's so much shaming, fear mongering content, especially in social media, about like, if you don't do this right as a parent, you're screwing up your kid. You know, you have to do it perfectly, especially like in the realm of gentle parenting. There's just so much like shame and fear mongering that I think is so, so unhelpful. And we know that parental anxiety and guilt and burnout are so bad for both parents and kids. So yet what I write are parenting advice books, right? So like, how do I do that without contributing to the fear mongering? And I don't know that I'm always successful, but the Substack that I write is really like, how can we bring science and nuance to parenting advice to make it less shame inducing, to, you know, look at the big picture. I mean, a lot of times I'm saying, okay, this thing that you may have heard on social media about, like, if you yell at your kids twice, they're more likely to become delinquent. Like, here's why that research is really not trustworthy, or here's why there's actually no research saying that, and you should know that. So a lot of what I choose to cover is in the service of trying to reduce stress among parents. And so in the book, I mean, there's a lot of detail in the book, but I also, in the introduction and the epilogue, I talk a lot about how it's really much more about like big picture parenting choices and approaches and strategies, like what kinds of conversations can you have with your kids that might help them develop, be less likely to become racist or, polarized. And it's like, but there's a lot of room for mistakes, and there's a lot of room for doing things differently depending on who your kid is and who your family is. And I try to talk about how there's just so much wiggle room, but here are some things that might help broadly. But it's really hard because I'm sure there are people who will read this and it'll be stressful for them to read about the various strategies that because there's a lot of stuff in the book and it might feel overwhelming. So it's like, it's very, very tricky, but I do try to, I don't know.
I'd be really curious about the social media chapter and what kind of reaction you get, because in the social media chapter, one of the themes is that there isn't actually great evidence showing that it's damaging to kids. I personally felt very reassured by that and lost some guilt along the way, so thank you for that. But I thought you did actually thread that needle, because it makes the research-based approach is actually what's sort of really key there, that you look at the studies, and it's probably the only part of the book where I thought you were critical of someone, in particular Jonathan Haidt. Yeah, so that was interesting, but I do think there's a lot of fear-mongering in that research, so I was very glad you took aim at that.
Oh, good. That was definitely a choice that I was like, am I going to regret this? Am I going to have John Haidt after me? I don't think that he cares about, he's not going to read the book. But I was a little scared, and I had a few friends, including Sherpies, read that chapter and like, am I threading this needle? Like, am I going too far? Because I do agree with him on a lot of stuff. There's just certain things I don't agree with him on. Anyway, so I feel like there was another part of your question that I'm now forgetting, but
I was just wondering if you feel like readers are more open to advice and expertise of child psychology, developmental experts.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like I have a very self-selecting audience in my Substack. My Substack subscribers love science, and they love learning what the research says, but they are there by choice because they like science. And so it's really hard for me to say. I mean, it does feel like there is a contingent of parents, mostly probably progressive. I mean, I know most of my readers are progressive, who are very, they welcome it and they're very interested in it. But whether that's true for society, I say that like a lot of the people who need to read my parenting books are not the people who are going to read my parenting books, sadly. Like, I'm kind of preaching to a choir. I do feel that's a concern that in writing these, in writing the books that I write.
I don't know about that, Melinda. I feel like,
know?
no, I think I learned a lot reading your book.
Okay.
Yeah,
good.
there were definitely, there was a reason I was tabbing so many things, not all for this conversation.
That's good. There's like a bias that it has a name where when you learn stuff, you start to assume everybody else already knows it
Confirmation bias.
Well, no, it's
No.
but there's some weird thing. I don't know. And so sometimes I feel like I'm like, well, this is like what I've written. Like, doesn't everybody already know this? So it's actually really nice to know that there are things that.
No, it's because you read those hundreds of studies.
Yes,
That's
right.
why you know all that stuff.
Right.
We don't know that stuff.
Fair.
There were more questions in that back row.
Thanks so much.
I'm wondering how you guys decided what genre your book should fall into. Sorry, sausage gets made question. But I'm like Melinda, your book, I could see it being in the science nerdy section. I would frequent that, or I could see it being in the parenting section and never walk in. So I'm wondering how you made that decision for both of you, and I guess it becomes an audience question, intended audience question.
Well, I don't know that I mean, I know that I imagine my audience to be parents. They're going to be mostly mothers. I wish there were more fathers who would read parenting books, but you know, it's funny. I go to bookstores and it's like in a different. I'll find my book in different sections. Like sometimes it'll be in psychology, sometimes it'll be in self-help, sometimes it'll be in parenting, sometimes it'll be in science. And so I don't know. Like I think it can be thought of in different genres depending on who's thinking about it. But because it's like service and parenting advice, I think it's definitely like a parenting book for parents and other caregivers for sure. Mine is anyway.
Yeah, I see my audience is mostly mothers. I would like it to be more fathers. It's probably not. I also would love to get people who are interested in like political news and ideas, but I don't know. I think something about having the word mothers in the titles like scares people off, but you know, it's just sort of I don't know. I hope it's more broad. It's interesting to like write a book and then see how the marketing department markets it, which isn't really like the author's decision. I mean, they just sort of like take it and run with it. So, but they seem to have mostly been targeting mothers. So I guess that's who it is. I am, because I think we also underestimate mothers. I mean, there's something about like the mothers in the title, but I think there's a lot of, you know, really people who are interested in politics who also happen to be mothers. So yes, I mean, it cuts out like half the population if it's not fathers, but I guess lots of books sort of have some narrow audience. So yeah.
I have a question, particularly for Abby. How do you decide like how far back you want to study, right? Like you have the, I started reading the book, but there's the snippet about, you know, in Utah and this whole like trad wife thing, and just the idea of like what's natural in the first year of motherhood, and like, were you tempted to go back to like hunter-gatherers? Is that like, were you tempted to look into like what is natural, you know, like how have we done this in our millions of years of
Yeah, that is a good
existence?
question. I know, because you could just sort of like go on
forever.
forever. Yeah. It sort of naturally fell into like post World War II, because I feel like that's sort of where we are today. It's like this post World War II organization of society, and that, you know, was so like Japan and Finland were both so devastated by that war, and the U.S. was clearly changed by it, that I think mostly I just sort of started there, and then I also just don't feel like I'm an expert in like going back, like with the science and the history of like going back farther. But it is interesting. I mean, you could do one country and just go back like very far in that. But yeah, it's a good question, and it's hard to limit yourself sometimes when it's such a broad topic. So I tried.
So this is mostly for Abby. Both of you spoke a lot about the different degrees of involvement of like the mother and father in parenting, and I'm curious. You know, you had mentioned one of the couples was polyamorous, and there's, you know, more same-sex parents now, and I'm curious whether you think that families looking very different. In your research, have people been able to find structures that work for them, or particularly for women, is it still kind of more of the same challenges?
Yeah, that's right. That's a great question. I think in some ways it's sort of the same, unfortunately. I mean, you just sort of see, like, even in their relationship, which was non-traditional, and they really aspired to like be outside the sort of norm of the LDS culture and all this stuff. But there was something about, and maybe it was partly because of the way that our family leave is set up, that she was the only one home and he had to go right back to work, but she became the primary parent like almost immediately, and their whole idea had been that that was not what they were going to do, and she was trying to like support him and having relationships outside the marriage. But then of course there's like a finite amount of time in everyone's day, and so even just figuring out how to do that with a baby schedule is like complicated. So it was sort of funny to see them run up against the like, I mean, I think a lot of people do this. You think that you're going to like recreate parenthood and have this like really chill, totally new take on it. And then it turns out that it's like completely impossible because you have a baby who's like demanding and you're up all night and you can't leave them and all this stuff. So yeah, it's really interesting to see. But it was also interesting to think about like the different ways this has been done before and the sort of like community organization around this, ways that relationships have been set up in different societies sort of before the nuclear family, both in Japan and Kenya. They have very similar postpartum traditions where there's like the woman stays inside for a month and all the women in the community come and visit her, and you know there's a lot of social interaction. There's like medicinal foods that are brought. I mean, it's like everyone's sort of, they're on different sides of the planet, but they came to the same conclusion that this is really the best way to support the birthing mother. So despite all the sort of like modern configurations, I think ultimately there are some things that are sort of true no matter what.
It's also really hard to battle the sort of socializing of how we, even with Sarah, even though their relationship was non-traditional, she was the one who seemed like who was doing a lot of the caregiving, not just of the baby, but of him.
Yeah, she's talking to him about his relationship with this man. I mean, it was like, give yourself a break.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
and when I was reading your book too, Melinda, especially the part where you talk about how you started to notice that your daughter is more helpful around the house, I was thinking that I live in a household where my husband is extremely helpful. I don't think we follow traditional gender norms all that closely. He cooks every meal in the house, and yet after reading that part, I realized that's true. Actually, even in our house, we have an older boy and a younger girl, and the younger girl is helping me way more, and also sometimes helping her brother than the boy. So that really made me realize it's just like it's so hard to fight these gender norms that are all around us. I'm gonna take moderator prerogative here and say we're probably close to wrapping up, but I want to ask both of you if you could just briefly say how you balanced being a parent yourself with writing this very demanding book.
I had 8 months to write this and report it, and I was also my marriage was disintegrating in that 8 months, so it was really hard. It was really hard. I don't really know how I got it done sometimes. I just I rented we were also renovating our house at the time. So I rented a office space and it didn't have any windows, which I was really sad about. And then I was like, no, that's good because I will just lock myself in here and write a chapter this afternoon, I think in some ways it was kind of a really interesting exercise in figuring out, okay, like really planning out how much reporting can I do in like 3 weeks? Can I report and write an entire chapter on a huge topic in like 3 or 4 weeks? And the answer is yes, if you really have to. But yeah, and with my kids were, my kids are older now. So when I was writing this was last year. So they were like 9 and 13, 9 and 12. And that makes a big difference when they're older because they are much, they can take care of themselves after school. So when they came home from school, I would just keep working and I would say, do your homework. And, yes, you can go on your iPad for an hour because I need to keep getting things done. And so there was a lot of that, the irony, of course, of like writing a parenting book about how to be a good parent while I'm like telling my kids I can't parent them. There's a little something there where I was definitely feeling a little guilt. Yeah, it sort of made me realize like you can get, if you have to and you have deadlines, I'm sure you know this well with your job, you can get more done than you think you can sometimes, but it's not always easy.
Yeah, that's true. Like mothers are very good at time organization in some ways, so I think that helps. But for me, it was a little different because I had just moved back from Japan and I was sort of trying to reestablish myself and my career. And because we went to Japan actually for my husband's job initially. So this was sort of like, okay, now I get to do my thing. And I was just like really excited to have the time to myself to just write and like have a reason to do it. I was like, sorry, I can't like do dinner tonight because I have to write. And so that I actually really enjoyed that aspect of it.
I love that.
Yeah. Like using work as an excuse not to do childcare. It's like a really perfect. So I don't know. I mean, it is really hard to balance like anything, but I don't know. Yeah, it's the same kind of thing. Like I don't know. I don't really know looking back how it actually all came together, but somehow it did, and I'm
It's
like
like
glad
you've
to be on
both
this
buried
side
the
of it.
memory. It's like PTSD. I can't think about it.
Yeah, I blocked it
It's
out.
over
It's
now.
like birth or something like I don't know. Yeah.
Well, thank you both very much for your time and for writing these great books. And honestly, I really do believe that even if you're not a parent, you should read them. They're very interesting and you learn a lot. So thank you for doing all the research and the hard work of writing them.
Thank you.